トランプ政権で国務長官をしていたポンペオ氏が FOX ニュースに出演して中国共産党問題について話しました。中国は世界保健機関に対してウイルスの起源と対応に関する捜査をさせません。ポンペオは中国が新型コロナウイルスが発生した際にウイルスの存在を隠蔽し、医師やジャーナリストを抹殺した中国に責任を取らせなければいけないと主張します。バイデン政権、菅政権はこのような呼びかけを行うのでしょうか。なぜ、ポンペオ元国務長官のように中国に立ち向かわないのでしょうか。
Joining us now for more on this is former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who is now a Fox News contributor. Mr. Secretary, welcome.
It's great to be with you. Thanks for having me on this afternoon.
Of course, good to see you. The vice chairman of the China's Health Committee said this, quote, "It is impossible for us to accept such an origin tracing plan." Why do you think it's impossible for Chinese officials to accept something from the WHO to look at the lab in Wuhan?
Well, my guess is because they know the answer to what any legitimate investigation would find. I think they know that this indeed did come out of their laboratory, and while we don't have the evidence to prove it, they certainly do. And so my sense is the reason they don't want anybody looking at it is because they know what this would mean for the Chinese Communist Party. They know that they have lied to the world, they know that they have lied to their own people, and they know that they foisted this virus upon the world, costing millions of lives and now billions and billions of dollars worth of wealth. The last thing the Chinese Communist Party is to be stuck with the stain of having operated a lab, covered it up, disappeared journalists, disappeared doctors, only to have the WHO come in and find that, in fact, it did come from that laboratory. That's my sense of why they want to cover it up. I know Dr. Fauci says that the Chinese have every reason to let them in. That's just crazy talk. The Chinese have every reason to to continue the cover-up that they've now been engaged in for almost 20 months.
How can the world try and breach that stonewall?
The answer is going to have to be that there'll be some brave Chinese scientist who decides to release the documents, the paperwork, the trail, maybe even the original virus that they might have squirreled away somewhere if they tried to destroy it. It's going to be very difficult. The WHO will never pull this off. The WHO, when it had its opportunity, sided with the Chinese Communist Party. It became political, frankly, and that's too bad because they had the opportunity to actually do their one job. The one job the WHO has is to prevent pandemics. They had a chance to go work on it, and instead they sided with Xi Jinping at the moment of the point of inflection. At that one time, they gave up their right to be viewed as a non-political organization.
And what would it mean if, as you say, the truth comes out that this did come from the Wuhan lab and they try to cover it up, lie about it? We've had all this death and devastation across the globe, and it is continuing.
So the Chinese Communist Party has to be held accountable. Frankly, that's true, Eric, whether it's the case that it came from this laboratory or not. The cover-up itself is an international crime under international law. The Chinese have to be held accountable. There are many, many tools with which to do that. We don't have time to go in that this afternoon, but international law makes clear that every country has the right to proceed to make claims against a government that voice harm on them. Imagine this had been done with a kinetic activity. There had been millions of people killed around the world. The Chinese Communist Party knew that they had a contagious virus on their hands. They knew that it was highly lethal, and they permitted that virus to get on airplanes, travel around the world, knowing that this would infect millions of people and cause devastation. That alone, without even getting to the answer of precisely whether it came from the lab or someplace else in Wuhan, this is something that the world is going to have to unite to impose a real cost on the Chinese Communist Party, and then importantly, work to make sure that something like this never happens again by making sure that lab gets shut down.
You know, you're right. Whether or not it came from the lab or not, or from that seafood market, the food markets, from bats. I mean, it sounds to me like it's a crime against humanity. I mean, literally a crime against humanity. If they didn't come clean, they didn't stop it, they didn't address all the professionals that they should have and dealt with it and warned the world.
You nailed it. Look, there's a technical definition for crimes against humanity. I don't want to debate that.
Okay.
But your point that the Chinese Communist Party knew full well what they had on their hands. And instead of doing the right thing, reporting to the WHO, reporting to the world, telling the whole world what was going on so that we could all address this collectively together to do our best, they chose a different path. They chose a path that they had to have known would result in millions of deaths around the world. And I don't know if you've seen, you mentioned in your open that the Chinese now have the Delta variant. That data looks to be getting worse. But I got to tell you, no matter what they say about what's going on inside of China, I don't believe it for a second. I saw they reported more cases. They haven't talked about fatalities. We know what happened to Wuhan. We know how many people were killed in Wuhan at the front end of this thing. And we know what the Chinese Communist Party did to the rest of the world. For that alone, for that cover-up alone, and the transmission of this virus around the world, real costs have to be imposed on the Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah, right now the story is that a Russian visitor landed at the airport in Nanjing, infected airport workers, then it spread. They've closed down highways. They're quarantined people. Do you think we're on the verge of another pandemic coming from China because they're lying about everything?
You know, I have no idea if somebody came from Russia to do that. The fact that the Chinese government has said it gives me no faith that that actually happened. I don't know what story they'll make up next time. Yes, there's a real risk, not only a risk that this is now spreading throughout China. Look, they have a vaccine. Sinopharm has a vaccine. I don't know how many people have taken it. And we, of course, have seen a little bit of data, but we don't really know how effective that Chinese vaccine is. But we know this. We know that if the Chinese Communist Party has a problem, we know if this escapes again, we know that this lab is still operating. There's every reason to believe that the Chinese Communist Party will do precisely what it did back in the end, at the end of 2019, when they first knew that they had doctors getting sick in that laboratory. They began to have their political figures, not their health officials, work on covering up that virus and making sure that the world couldn't attribute to them. And the darndest thing is we now know precisely that it came from Wuhan, and we have with high confidence evidence that it came from that laboratory.
Yeah, you know, finally, Mr. Secretary, you don't have to be Columbo, I mean, to figure this one out. Look, you got that hero doctor who died, right? Then you put in November 2019, 3 researchers reportedly were sick and had to be hospitalized. This is in November. And take a look what was in the Wall Street Journal in June about this. Experts writing, quote, the COVID-19 pathogen has a genetic footprint that has never been observed in a natural coronavirus. The presence of the double CGG, it's a fancy talk, sequence, is strong evidence of gene splicing, and the absence of diversity in the public outbreak suggests gain of function acceleration. The scientific evidence points to the conclusion that the virus was developed in a laboratory. Your final word.
I'm only chuckling, not because it's not tragic and sad. It absolutely is. I'm chuckling because the world, the scientific community rejected this when our administration spoke about this. When I went on television and spoke about this in the spring of 2020, we had conversations taken down. We were mocked. We were called racist for acknowledging precisely what you described. And now the world can see what we were able to see, what we were able to talk about publicly. They can see what's happened. And the tragedy continues. The Chinese Communist Party is directly accountable for every one of these lives that's been lost.
The Chinese Communist Party directly accountable, says former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Mr. Secretary, thank you for joining us. Good to see you always here on
Thank you, sir. Have a good afternoon, sir.
Of course.
Yes, sir.